be even Finley.
All right. Thanks, Brian. See you soon. All right. I appreciate all of you who are here. This first slide, I just want to take a moment to say this is an original piece of art that appears on my book, and it's a piece of artwork by African American artist Delano Dunn. And I think the piece of art itself could be the thesis for this presentation. It's a work of art called Relieved of the Weight. And as you can see, it's really, you see two slave women are in slave garb, and above them, what looks like a UFO. And so you think about the weight of this world, in particular in slavery, and the relationship that it might have to this UFO to relieve the weight of existence, or that particular kind of existence. And in a certain sense, I think that even could be the thesis of this presentation, Black UFO Religion and the Nation of Islam, an introduction to Black experience, extraterrestrials, and new directions. And here's what I'm arguing. Here's my thesis. While the most notable African American UFO tradition is that of the Nation of Islam, African American UFO tradition, this particular iteration of UFOs and religion exists in a larger milieu that constitute a distinct UFO tradition that has to be understood against an irreducible experience of American anti-Blackness, while also holding space for the relationship between Black experience and an other cosmic reality that the tradition posits. The NOI, or the Nation of Islam, is the clearest example of these claims, and the lecture will introduce some of the new directions related to UFOs and aliens in which the group is now moving. And so what I'm basically arguing here is not about the reality of UFOs. Like, to me, that's not even an interesting conversation. I've been more than convinced for quite some time. But what I am arguing is to make sense of these UFO traditions, one has to pay particular attention to Black experience. And what I'm really talking about is anti-Black violence. 250 years of slavery, another 100 years of lynching after Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and so on, the prison industrial complex, police violence, and so on, to make sense of what UFOs mean to these groups. And I think I also want to note that UFOs have particular symbolic relationship to Black experience. I mean, if one thinks about the slave trade, one thinks about a person living in Africa who's never seen Europeans, and all of a sudden Europeans show up on the shores, and you're trying to make sense of it. And so you mythologize that perhaps these are dead ancestors who return, right? And all of a sudden, there's this violent slave trade. You end up in the bottom of a hull of a ship, in the dark, in filth, over a 3-month journey across the ocean in a ship, right? With these folks you've never seen before. And all of a sudden you end up in a new world. I mean, in a sense, that's a metaphor for alien abduction that initiates the modern Black experience. Hey, Hussein. All right, so my particular lens is religious studies. Although I work at the intersection of Black studies, I'm really interested in how African Americans use UFOs, narratives about aliens and the cosmos to make meaningful sense of their lives here, but also to make worlds for themselves through language and symbols and so on. And so when I say religion, for me, I'm not talking about gods or creeds or institutions necessarily. I'm talking about meaning-making practices, right, that render the world coherent. And the word is orientation. And by orientation, Charles Long means how one comes to terms with the meaning of one's existence in the ultimate sense. So those things that you do to make your world coherent, to make sense of who you are, to locate yourself ultimately in this world with meaning, that's what I mean by religion. which means there are a lot of things that could be religious, which I understand as religious, that have nothing to do with churches or mosques or temples or institutions or creeds, but are part of people's world building and meaning making practices. And so I'm really interested then in the Nation of Islam, in how they then go about crafting and remaking this world, how they talk about the cosmos, such that, again, the world becomes coherent. And that's what I'm calling mythology. And by mythology, I'm not talking about it's not true. I simply mean that it's not necessarily historic or scientific, but a highly symbolic narrative that they construct from many sources, science fiction, genetics, and so on, to make a narrative that explains their world, that gives them some sense of agency in a world where violence was a part of their everyday existence. So for me, this is what mythology does for the Nation of Islam. And I talk about this mythology in 2 chapters in my book, and I'll just say something about it. The mythology, or what I'm calling mythology, what they call the story of Yaqub, this renegade Black scientist who basically created white people in the laboratory through genetic, what they call grafting, becomes a way of making sense of violence. In other words, the mythology is theodician. And by theodician, what I mean is, so theodicy has to do with trying to make sense of the world, to protect this notion of God's goodness in a world where people suffer, evil and human suffering. But for something to be theodician, it doesn't have to do with God necessarily. It's simply one of the responses, or many responses, to making sense of evil. And so for me, this mythology is a theodician one, in the sense that it's trying to make sense of Black existence. And so I took all of these various sources, which were had never before been put together, because there's no one coherent story of Yaqub, or the mythology of Yaqub, that's in one place. The Nation of Islam doesn't really have one. And I put it together from all these sources that I could find, and I divided it into these 5 stages. The first one is the creation of God and the cosmos, where God, for the Nation of Islam, created God's self from a single atom. And of course, the second part is this renegade Black scientist and the destruction of the original people. And so that gives you a sense of the theodician aspect of the mythology, because it's trying to explain the violence of the original people. And by the way, the original people, who were understood as Black in the Nation of Islam, are what we would call now Asian, Native American, Latino, Black, and so on. It's a really expansive view of what Black is, not what we might think on the surface. The third part is East Asia and the original people of the Earth. After there was an explosion on the original planet where the original family lived, the moon was split into the planet was split into the sun and the moon. The surviving tribe ended up in the part of the Earth that we now understand as the Nile Valley. Fourth, Yaqub and the making of the white race and genocide explains why Black people for 400 years have suffered violence at the hands of white people, when it makes no real sense. And their explanation is because that was the genetic process. Their intent was to kill and destroy Black people. That's the only explanation you need. They can't help it. This was their purpose and function. 5, the hidden God, Freemasonry, and UFOs is really the part that I focus on mostly in the book, and is the most relevant here. God, for the Nation of Islam, hovers above the earth in what they call the mother wheel, which Farrakhan says we would understand as a UFO. It's where the Nation of Islam says Elijah Muhammad is now. It's where Minister Farrakhan says he's going to go after he departs, not dies, but departs. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on my notes. I simply want to point out that the first prophet of the Nation of Islam was Elijah Muhammad, who said that the founder of the Nation of Islam, who founded in 1930, Master Fard Muhammad, who was God for the group, taught him about this dreadful looking plane that hovered above the earth called the mother plane that would one day bring an end to the age of white domination and liberate the earth from suffering. I do want to point out also that this mother wheel, according to the mythology of the Nation of Islam, was created in the Japanese islands by Japanese scientists, again, who were also understood as Black in their metaphysics and cosmology. All right, so Elijah Muhammad died in 1975. His son, Warith Deen Muhammad, then he was named Wallace, took over the movement. Farrakhan thought he was going to be the successor. For all intents and purposes, he was the putative successor. Wallace, or Warith, as he came to be known, outsmarted him, outmaneuvered him, and then threatened him not to interfere as he took over the Nation of Islam. He soon moved the group away from its historic and traditional teachings and much more toward a Sunni form of Islam, while at the same time, at least a dozen, if not more, other Nation of Islam groups started claiming to be the true heirs of the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who died in 1975. So even today, when we talk about the Nation of Islam, we really have to say which one. The one that I'm talking about mostly here is the one that most of us know. It's the most famous one. It's the larger one, led by Minister Louis Farrakhan, but it's certainly not the only one. And they tend to be rival groups, by the way, right? They have different beliefs. The one led by Silas Muhammad is a much more conservative version of the Nation of Islam. All right, so Farrakhan, I won't call it a revelation, but around 1978, after being in Wallace's movement for 3 years, he says 30 months. 30 is a really important number in his numerology, which appears all the time in Farrakhan's writing and speeches. He said, I'm done with this. Wallace has betrayed his father. He has taken and distorted the teachings. I want to reconstitute the true teachings of the Nation of Islam. So in 1978, he left. He says he felt like he was excommunicated and started what we now know as the Nation of Islam, led by Louis Farrakhan. But I think there's a broader context that I want to place the Nation of Islam in and African American UFO traditions. They see themselves as singular. In other words, the Nation of Islam, from my perspective, like I was just telling Paul, owns the UFO phenomena. For them, the UFO phenomena is about them, the Nation of Islam in particular, and has special meaning for Louis Farrakhan. But what I want to do, and when I write the book on the subject, is show the broader range of African American UFO traditions. And of course, many of you remember Sun Ra. Sun Ra claims himself to be a distant relative, distant cousin of Elijah Muhammad of the Nation of Islam. And I think that's important to point out. He also claimed to have been transported to Saturn through a process that he called, if I can say it right, transmolecularization. It's not clear exactly what he means, but I think what he means in some sense was that his essence, his cells, all of him were transported, not necessarily in a vehicle, even though he doesn't really talk about the means very much, to Saturn. And that experience really shaped the rest of his life and his teachings. Some of you might remember the musical group Parliament and Parliament Funkadelic. What you may not know is their most famous album, that is Parliament, famous album for me, and for me the best one, called Mothership Connections, was actually influenced by what Bootsy Collins and George Clinton said was an alien abduction or UFO abduction. But again, I want to continue to reinscribe and note this trope of Black existence. So even after this, what they claim was a UFO abduction, they pointed back to Africa and to African history and the Doggons of Mali. And so what you hear in these traditions is on some level, as a scholar, what I'm arguing here is my own scholarly interpretation of what these groups and what UFOs and aliens and the cosmos mean for African Americans in these particular traditions. But what I want to suggest by talking about what they're saying is that I didn't just come up with that, just out of my own scholarly views and impose that on them. They are the ones who, in fact, are talking about Black experience. Some of you might remember, I don't have a slide of him here, Riley Martin, who used to be on the Howard Stern show. Well, how Riley Martin talks about an alien abduction. He talks about it much in his book, The Coming of Tan, right? But even when he talks about it, he's talking about, and he's going back and referring to life in Mississippi, working fields as a sharecropper, and the terror of being Black. And so this isn't me necessarily making a scholarly imposition on these groups, but following the signals that they're giving in their own explanations of their own experience. And so you see here George Clinton in this picture, which I love, in this sort of funked out Black UFO garb, again, which I really love, and other songs on the album you might remember, Unfunky UFO, Star Child, and so on. But again, there's some connection to their own UFO experience that I wanted to point out. And so there's another important UFO tradition from these two Black women who call themselves the UFO twins, Earlene and Shirlene Wallace, who lived near Dallas, Texas. And again, you can tell from the title the trope of Africa and Black experience. So even their title is From Motherland, Africa to Mothership. So connecting Black origins again to UFOs. And only one of them claimed to have had a UFO experience. I think it was Earlene. And what she describes were beings that she called the Galactics. The Galactics. But when she talks about, in this quote that I'm not going to read up here, how she experienced them, she described them, quote, as beautiful Black women, close quote. And so that's, in fact, how she described these beings that she calls the Galactics. But they also talk about the subjugation of women, racism, and so on in their work, and why their UFO revelations are so important, and what they can teach the world about Black people and, in fact, women, in particular Black women. All right, so Prophet Yahweh was a really interesting guy.